Hello everyone, and welcome back to our first talk here at the Aquinas Institute, our first lecture at the beginning of the academic year. For those of you who don't yet know me, my name is Marcus Gibson, and I work here at Aquinas directing its initiative in Catholic thought. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce for us as a speaker this evening, JD Flynn, the founder and editor-in-chief of The Pillar, the Catholic multimedia journalism project. And in just a few moments, he's going to be speaking with us on the subject of how to seek and find the truth in an age of polarization and scandal. Especially here at a university, as students, as scholars, seeking the truth, being able to pursue the truth in a way that's grounded in our faith, but also open to the different voices that we hear in our contemporary culture, knowing how to walk in that path and sort of grow an intellectual virtue. It's a topic that's important to us all, and I'm particularly excited to be able to introduce JD Flynn this evening. Before co-founding The Pillar, JD Flynn was editor-in-chief of the Catholic News Agency, and before that he was chancellor of the Archdiocese of Denver and a senior advisor to Bishop James Conley in the Diocese of Lincoln. He has an MA in theology from the Franciscan University of Steubenville and a JCL in canon law from the Catholic University of America. So here to speak with us this evening, please join me in welcoming JD Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. First of all, the first reason I'm very grateful to you is because when people ask you to come and give a talk, you say yes, and then it gets closer to the talk and you start to think, well, probably no one will come, and you start to feel bad about yourself. So if nothing else, you've already allayed all of my self-doubts by just showing up. Thank you very much. Second of all, thank you for coming. I'm very, very honored to be here because, come on, it's Princeton, right? Who doesn't want to give a talk? At Princeton, the crown jewel of the American intellectual and academic system, with the exception, of course, of my beloved alma mater, the Franciscan University of Steubenville. That is a joke. Please understand, that is a joke. This is freaking Princeton, right? So it's very great to be here, and I'm very grateful that you all have invited me to come and speak with you. The talk that Marcus just suggested that I was going to give sounds really good, but it's not exactly the talk that I'm going to give, so I hope you don't feel like you got a bait and switch. What I want to talk about is our role in the life of the church, our place in the life of the church, our place especially as Catholics, most of us lay Catholics, in the project of the church's reform and renewal. But before I do that, I guess I want to preface my remarks with this. Again, this is Princeton, right? So if you don't go to Princeton and someone asks you to give a talk at Princeton, you're like, wow, they're going to be pretty smart there, and I bet you guys are very smart. And so I feel obliged to sort of say from the very beginning that I'm not an academic or even really an intellectual. I teach canon law at a seminary in California in addition to my other jobs, but I teach it right after lunch, and so mostly I just talk about canon law to a room full of sleeping seminarians, and so this feels different already. You guys have pulses, you seem to be awake, that's very, very great. But it sounds like you've taken a canon law class, I can tell. But yeah, this is not an academic lecture. It's not an academic lecture. I want to talk a little bit about my own experience in the life of the church and perhaps your experience in the life of the church, and then some of the things that I think God is calling us to as lay Catholics today. Most of that will be born out of my experience as a journalist. I'm trained as a canon lawyer, but I work as a journalist, and journalist is a very polite way of saying that I'm a professional drinker. It is my job to drink and to encourage other people to drink and then to tell me interesting stories about their lives. So a big part of my job is to say, like, no, I got the next round. Please go on and tell me what you were saying. And as long as you're at the right bars with the right people, that can be extremely productive. I don't know if you guys are at the right bars with the right people yet, but I'm going to try and buy Father Zach some drinks later and see if I learn anything interesting, right? So that's a big part of my job, actually. It's a fun one. I would encourage you to go in it if you like making enemies and you don't like making money. Journalism is a fun thing to do. If you have interest in like a good credit score or paying your mortgage or getting braces for your kids, do anything else. Don't do this. But my kids, they have crooked teeth, but they can be proud of their dad, the professional drinker, I guess. Anyway, with all of that said, what I want to talk about tonight is the reform and the renewal of the church, because one of the mandates of the Second Vatican Council, one of the strong encouragements of the Second Vatican Council, which takes a high view of our role as lay Christians, not only in the world but in the society of the church, is that each of us has a call and a vocation. Each of us has a particular job to help to affect the renewal of the life of the church in the world and the reform of the life of the church internally. Each of us has a role to play in the church living up to her sacred mission, in the church living up to the things God has called her to do and the things God has called her to be. Each of us is called to help the church to live in the world proclaiming the gospel, and to do so with integrity and holiness and effective witness. And if you pay attention to the life of the church, you probably realize that the church is in need of both reform, which is the sort of authoritatively driven corrective to negative behavior, and renewal, which is the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to more effectively and more boldly proclaim the gospel and serve the poor and worship God. The church is in need of both of those things. And I'd like to just sort of talk about some of the areas in which the church is in need of reform and renewal, and then some of the things that we can do about it. And I think it's important for us to talk about some of the things that we can do about it, or some of the things that we're called to do about it, because one of the things that's a challenge for us as American Christians, or Christians of the Democratic West, is that we don't know exactly how to sort of live and move and have our being in a society which is not predicated on liberal democracy, but predicated on a very sort of different system of authority and a very different sense of teleological mission. And so I think it's important to kind of reflect on how it is to be different as Catholics, how it is to live differently in the church than we're sort of conditioned to live in our contemporary American society. But first, why does the church need reform? Perhaps that's a question that seems like it answers itself, but I think it's worth kind of reflecting on two areas in which the church is in need of reform, and then how that impacts the need for the church's renewal. The first, of course, is for the church to live in accord with the integrity that she promises to her members, to live in accord with governance which is exercised with excellence in Christian virtue. If you I think all of us have the experience of the past few years of the difficulty, if you have been practicing the faith for a while, of realizing the failings of the church that we might not have anticipated, the failings of the church's leaders that we might not have been anticipated, but which have been sort of brought to light by virtue of the Theodore Cardinal McCarrick scandal of 2018, which was 5 years ago now. Some of you guys look like you were in middle school 5 years ago, so I'm like, remember when you read about that in the paper, and you're like, first of all, we don't read newspapers, old guys. Second of all, we don't remember that. But maybe you do anyway. Your parents were talking about it or something. I don't know. The Theodore McCarrick scandal, I think, for a lot of Catholics is this sort of watermark moment that awakens them to a knowledge of the need for reform in the administrative and governing life of the church. I think many of us who have been practicing the faith for a while had this sort of narrative in our head. There were problems in the church in the United States. In 2002, the Boston Globe wrote about those problems. The bishops promised that they were going to fix those problems. They issued some documents which said that they were going to fix those problems. We got some policies which said that, like, you can't, which said that, like, we have to have the right kind of boundaries in the life of the church, and that we have to have the right kind of background checks in the right kind of in the life of the church, and we have to watch the right kind of videos about child protection in the life of the church. And after we had those things, everything was fine. We fixed it. I think a lot of people, until halfway through 2018, walked around with that narrative about kind of the moral life of the church in the United States. And then the Theodore McCarrick scandal hit, in which we learned that a prominent churchman who had been entrusted with position after position of authority by the Vatican, who seemed to have influence with the Pope and with other members of the College of Cardinals, who seemed to exercise influence on the world stage, who took junkets with the U.S. State Department all over the world, sort of delivering bags of cash to developing democracies, was someone who also lived this double life of profound moral depravity. And as we realized that, there was probably a great deal of institutional tolerance for that moral depravity. There were people who looked the other way. There were people who didn't say anything. There were people who were afraid to speak out, or people who didn't feel empowered to speak out. We realized that there were mothers writing letters to bishops and cardinals saying, please protect my children, please protect my son, and those letters were going unanswered. I think for a lot of people it was a sobering moment. And subsequent to that sobering moment was the publication of the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report, which was the first report to sort of, in recent years, to sort of comprehensively investigate how a number of bishops, all in one region, the state of Pennsylvania, had, is Penn a good school? I mean, it's not Princeton, right? So forget about it. It's sort of just playing to the Princeton crowd now. The Pennsylvania grand jury report came out where a grand jury sort of systematically looked at the handling of the issue of clerical sexual abuse in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And again, I think many people anticipating the release of that report had an idea about what the narrative would look like in their head. There used to be a problem in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And then it got kind of gradually better over the course of the 80s and the 90s. And then in 2002, it was in the newspaper a lot, and then the bishops put out some policies, and then it was better. And then the report came out, and it was heartbreaking. It was heartrending to realize, no, the real narrative is there used to be a problem. Some policies came out. Some of them helped to fix the problem. Most of them didn't, and they didn't sufficiently address the kind of underlying cultural problems that led to profound abuse and neglect in the life of the church already. That the church, although she had sort of, that church leaders, although they had sort of done a very good job of explaining a way in which they had undergone a cultural transformation, hadn't done a very good job of sort of bringing to light all of the things which allowed some of that to continue to fester. And that some of the tropes that we use to talk about this, some of the ways in which we talked about the fact that Catholic churches are safer in many ways for children than public schools, which is true, are insufficient because of the claims the church makes about herself. If you say that you're the sacrament of salvation, if you say that you're necessary for salvation, if you say you're the place at which the most sort of profound and intimate spiritual healing can take place, you have a far greater moral obligation to act with integrity than you do if you're just a public school, which doesn't make particularly grandiose sort of self-claims. They say you'll come and you get a mediocre education and you probably won't get into Princeton, right? But the church doesn't say that. The church makes a far greater claim about who she is and what she's been missioned to do. She promises that she's protected by the Holy Spirit. And indeed, we know that's true. And at the same time, we saw in the publication of the Pennsylvania grand jury report and the scandal of Theodore McCarrick and the recognition of institutional tolerance for Theodore McCarrick that in many cases, the leaders of the church were failing to live up to the claims that they made about themselves. I think that was, as the kids say, a real black pill moment for the life of the church. And do kids still say that or not really anymore? You're like, maybe a little, okay, other kids. I think that was a moment of, I think, profound despondency for a lot of American Catholics, and especially, you know, there are a few clerics in the room, especially for many members of the clerical caste of the American Catholic Church, many priests who felt we understand why we have had to endure a kind of particular hardship, a particular kind of target on our back, a particular kind of scrutiny before we engage in our ministry. We're doing that for the greater good. Suddenly realized, well, as much as we thought we were doing that for the greater good, we realized that our bishops weren't holding themselves accountable in the same way, and that led to profound spiritual harm for a great many people. So we had that experience of 2018, and we had promises of reform, and the bishops in January we had that experience in the summer of 2018, and in January of 2019, the bishops of the United States took a retreat at Mundelein Seminary, and they prayed together, and they came out of that retreat, and they said, we're going to fix this. And they attempted to fix it, and then they got into a sort of policy battle with the Vatican. The bishops of the U.S. said, we've got a plan. And the Holy See said, we don't really like your plan. We've got a better plan. And so after sort of much back and forth, in which a lot of people were sort of discouraged by the kind of politicking that seemed to go on and all of that, a plan was issued. The Pope said, we've got a plan to make things safer. It's a document that outlines sort of procedural investigative processes called Vos Estis Lux Mundi. You are the light of the world. I mean, how is that for a promise? We're so confident in this plan that we're going to call it, you are the light of the world, and invoke Christ himself and invoke the mission of the disciples of Christ to proclaim the gospel and to say, we're going to act with integrity now and here. And in fact, we've seen mixed results with regard to the implementation of that plan. We've seen good intentions by many church leaders, we've seen good intentions by many bishops, we've seen good intentions by the Pope, but we've seen mixed results in terms of the application of those policies to the life of the church and to some of the continually emerging scandals of clerical sexual abuse and neglect and institutional tolerance for that abuse and neglect. In recent months, and the headlines of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and a little website called The Pillar have been stories after stories of a Jesuit priest named Father Marco Rupnik, who's sort of this internationally renowned artist and regarded as a spiritual master of the world over, and who has begun to be revealed as a sacrilegious serial sexual abuser. And as that case has been revealed, and as the Vatican's handling of that case has been revealed, more and more Catholics the world over have realized we thought that there was a plan for institutional reform, and it hasn't yet been accomplished. And that's been, as I say, a source of great discouragement for a great many Catholics. Now, the good news is maybe that can be expected. Maybe that's the way that reform happens. Maybe you recognize that there's a problem, and then you begin in fits and starts to address that problem. But the challenge of transforming a culture is one which has both kind of a legal element and a spiritual element and a community element, and doesn't happen all at once and all overnight. And some of the pieces sort of don't fit in the sequence that you'd like. Maybe we can say that Vos Estis Lex Mundi has done good things for the life of the church merely because the law serves to encourage us to what is right and to what is just, right? That the law is instructive. And maybe the fact that we have instructive law, which has high aspirations towards justice, is the kind of thing that over time affects a cultural change. But if that's true, we can say at the same time that we see areas in which these problems have been recognized, in which people of goodwill have tried to apply the law fully and with integrity and as it's written, and we can see areas in which the problem has been merely recognized as a kind of PR problem, in which the media or complaining Catholics or the kind of scurrilous enemies of the church have been blamed for sort of ginning up problems rather than those problems being taken on their own terms and fully appreciated. And the harm of that is real. Most especially, the harm of that is real to people who are themselves the victims of one way or another, the immediate victims of clerical sexual abuse and neglect. And in the course of my work, I have been transformed by spending time with people who are the victims of clerical sexual abuse and neglect, of looking them in the eyes, of learning their names, of learning their stories, and gradually beginning to see that a narrative which has long been held in the church, which is that people who make these kinds of allegations want to in some way hurt the church, gradually beginning to see that characterization is false. But the fact of the matter is many of the people who have been harmed in the church are people who are closest to the church because they're the people who are most vulnerable to being taken advantage of. And so for myself, I have begun to realize through the experience of talking with people who've experienced these things and befriending them and knowing their name and looking in their eyes, I've begun to experience a kind of change in perception for myself of who it is that experiences these things and what the church can do about it. But on a large scale and for the whole of the church and for the highest administrative levels of the church and governance levels of the church, that process will take time. And I think we can say we're only at the sort of very beginning of it. So that's probably profound crisis number one for the church. Profound crisis number two for the church. This is kind of a bummer of a lecture. I'm very sorry. Jeez. This is why I rarely get invited back to a place, because they're like, wow, that was so sad. Thank you for coming. Here's your check and get the hell out, But I gave a nice lecture here one time that was happy, so I feel like now I get to give a sad one. Okay, so profound crisis number two in the life of the church. And profound crisis number two is probably a longer-term thing, and maybe the term profound crisis is not the right phrase, but area in need of reform number two in the life of the church, which is happening sort of simultaneously to this crisis of governance and credibility that we're seeing with the clerical sexual abuse crisis. The sort of second challenge of credibility is an ongoing kind of war of doctrinal interpretation that has sort of plagued the church over the past 50 years. So 50 years ago, we ended, almost 50 years ago, we ended the Second Vatican Council, an ecumenical council called by the Pope in order to renew the energies of the church to proclaim the gospel in the world. And at the same time to reform some laxity which had crept into the life of worship in the church, some laxity which had crept into the life of teaching in the church, to reform some laxity which had crept into religious life and bad habits which had sort of built up over centuries and centuries of the church living her life. The Second Vatican Council was called for two things, what we might call, well, we don't have to, but what we can call a ressourcement, a kind of looking back at the original sort of the life of the early church and the original apostolic zeal of the apostles and their immediate disciples, and then a kind of aggiornamento, a kind of way in which we can drink deeply from the fountain of the church's tradition and then find a way, aggiornamento means a kind of todaying, to find a way to proclaim in a way that's relevant to today the perennial teachings of the church and the zeal of the perennial zeal of the Christian life. So first we're going to go back and we're going to sort of see how exciting it was and what it meant to live as a Christian in those early centuries of the church, in which the church was facing the prospect in which Christians were facing the prospect of martyrdom, in which Christians were sort of coming to understand the profound mystery of the sacraments and coming to understand the profound mystery of the church as a sacrament of salvation. We're going to sort of renew our vision of that and align with the vision of those early Christians. And then we're going to think very carefully about how to engage a world with very complex philosophical problems and very kind of complex anthropologies and complex ways of looking at sort of day-to-day life. Figure out how to make the gospel answer the questions of the contemporary world. And that was an extremely exciting project, and it was a project which the bishops of the world spent years on. And of course, during those years, there were varied perspectives. And so if you read the sort of journals of the Second Vatican Council, the bishops kind of duked it out a little bit over how various things would go. But they kind of came to very beautiful consensus about what it means to be the church, about what it means to worship, about what it means to receive God's revelation, about what it means to proclaim the gospel in the modern world. And they did their best to articulate these things in the constitutions and decrees and documents of the Second Vatican Council. There was a ton of optimism, a ton of enthusiasm for what had happened. And then about 5 minutes later, when the council ended, everybody sort of ate a bowl of spaghetti and went home. And as soon as they got home, this is what they did. And as soon as they got home, there began what you might think of as a protracted war of spin. Some of the bishops and theologians who were attendant at the Second Vatican Council started writing books, not so much about what the documents of the Second Vatican Council said in many cases, but about what they thought the documents of the Second Vatican Council ought to have said. And then some of them started writing books about how they read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, which documents they thought had preeminence, which documents they thought sort of guided the others. Some of them started sort of pulling ideas that were rejected by the Council Fathers themselves. I mean, overtly rejected during the floor of this debate, and saying this was sort of in the spirit of the council. This is what we meant to do if it hadn't been for those guys over there. So this is the direction that the church should be going. And so there began across the life of the church around the world, especially in Europe and North America, especially sort of in the developed West, but really around the world, there began a protracted debate over sort of what the Second Vatican Council was, how to interpret it, how to understand it, and what it meant for everyday Christians. Most especially, there began to be this sort of debate between two camps about which document would sort of have preeminence in the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, which would be the sort of key to unlocking the rest of them. How would we understand it, and how would we move forward? And those were really serious kind of theological debates, but they weren't just theological debates. They played out in terms of how priests catechized their people in their parishes, how Catholic schools operated, how religious orders of religious sisters, communities of religious sisters and brothers chose to live their lives. And so there was a great deal of kind of disagreement and tension and competing visions in the life of the church that just kind of plagued us for decades, for the 60s and 70s and 80s. And gradually, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, many Catholics started to feel like those debates were over. Many Catholics started to feel like, okay, we're starting to get clarity. We're starting to get clarity from the Pope. We're starting to get clarity from the Vatican. We're starting to get clarity from our bishops. We're starting to get clarity from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is an unbelievable resource that if you haven't read, you should read, because the Catechism of the Catholic Church is awesome, and we've never had anything like it before in the history of the Church. This sort of comprehensive, adult, serious look at what it means to be a Catholic and what the claims of the Church are. So we started to feel like with all of these things, we have some clarity. We know how we're going to interpret the Second Vatican Council. Sure, it'll take some time. John Henry Newman said that councils, you have to think about the implementation. Councils happen over the course of a couple of years, but you have to think about the implementation of councils over the course of a couple of centuries. And he says councils are like springs. I'm from New Jersey, so I don't really know what a spring looks like. I've never seen one in real life, but I hear of them, and I understand, according to Newman, that when a spring is sort of first coming up from, and not even this part of New Jersey, but like the kind of Tony Soprano part of New Jersey, the bad part where he works, not the nice part where he lives. Like I landed at Newark Airport today, and I took the train right by where I used to live, and I was like, this is gritty. I'm like tougher than I thought I was, actually. So anyway. Newman says of springs that when the water is first coming out of the ground at the source of a spring, I suppose from an aquifer that's under intense positive pressure, and therefore water sort of springs out of the ground. I think that's how springs work. Right where it's coming out, it's all churned up, and there's a lot of dirt and mud, and nothing's very clear. You have just this sort of bubbling, frothing mess that's probably muddy, and there's white water, and there's so much energy, but not a lot of clarity. And Newman says the spring is always clearer further from the source. He says, with regard to ecumenical councils and the teachings of the church, the more sort of time you have for things to kind of mellow out and for things to kind of clarify and for all the sort of muck to settle out and fall to the bottom, the clearer you can understand what the thing was about. And so it's understandable that in those early decades after the Second Vatican Council, everything was kind of churned up and there was all this froth and there was all this kind of craziness and all this difficulty to understand. But I think many Catholics thought in the 1990s and the 2000s, these things have been resolved and we've begun to get clarity, and we have a way of reading the Second Vatican Council and we have a way of understanding it, and there's a theological project now to be accomplished of sort of taking the wisdom of the Second Vatican Council and putting it into practice in very many parts of the church. But that has changed in the past decade or so, and part of the reason why it's changed, very honestly, is because the Pope, who I think has done very many good things from the church, came into the papacy with a sort of different hermeneutic from the Second Vatican Council than some of his predecessors had, with different areas of emphasis, with different areas of import, with different perspectives on sort of how to read the Second Vatican Council. And in his different areas of emphasis, many of which I think were helpful and corrective to the life of the church, there began to renew some of those theological debates which I think many people had thought were settled. They began to renew some of these sort of fundamental debates about what is the Second Vatican Council about, and built into those debates are lots of sort of more latent debates about what does it mean to be a Christian at all? What is divine revelation? What is it to worship? What are we for? What makes us happy? All of those things are kind of embedded in the theological debates that the church has been having over the past couple of decades, and they've become more acute for us over the past 10 years. And I think, very honestly, if you kind of pay attention to the doctrinal debates of the life of the church, they've become really acute for us in the past 5 years. There have been sort of a rising voice of theologians with different perspectives and competing perspectives, and unlike the debates of the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s, these guys all freaking have Twitter, and they have and so they just what used to be sort of a debate that happened in academic journals has become a debate which happens across like a variety of platforms. Some of which are good and helpful and allow space for real and serious reflection, and some of which are like 180 characters of just nonsense and subtweeting, and these are from very serious people with like really good educations and really serious formation, but contributing to a kind of debate which is oftentimes limiting and which oftentimes is sort of inimical to a positive outcome. And so we've had this sort of crisis of debate, not only that we're relitigating things that many people thought were settled, but that we're doing it in the worst possible way. And that has created an incredible amount of division in the life of the church. And it's created, I think, a fairly strong amount of discouragement in the life of the church. And people have different reactions to it. There are people who sort of look at that, and I've talked with these people, and you probably have too, who say, boy, it sounds like what it means to be a Christian is that you fight with other Christians about what it means to be a Christian. No, thank you. That's not for me. There are other people who sort of look at this debate, and a growing number of people who sort of look at this debate and say, boy, you guys are fighting a lot about the Second Vatican Council. Maybe the whole thing is worth just throwing out the window, right? And there are an increasing number of young people who say, we think maybe the spring is the problem. We think maybe this stuff is so embedded in this stuff is controversy and ambiguity and a lack of certitude that this whole thing is the problem. And so you see a growing number of people who say, we would just move away from what the Council Fathers said. This would be better put in a drawer and forgotten. And of course, then you get a pushback from that, and then you get a sort of resurgence of people who say, no, we need to sort of recover the experience of the thing. But all of this debate, I think, has led to a lot of discouragement for people who live in the life of the church and have the opportunity to see some of this play out. A lot of confusion, a lot of ambiguity. And so on the one hand, we're in this moment where we have this sort of crisis of governance authority, where many people around the world have read about the challenges that the church has had living with integrity, according to her own teachings on sexuality and governance and justice and radical solidarity with the poor. And on the other hand, we have this sort of doctrinal crisis where a growing number of people are aware of and discouraged by the relitigation of debates that were once thought settled. These are the areas where the church, it seems to me, is most immediately in need of reform and renewal. But these areas, these issues for the church, in a certain way to me, seem to come at the worst possible time. because we're living in a moment of greater sort of media openness and awareness of these kinds of debates, a greater sort of open society in terms of the sort of leveling playing field of the internet and social media than ever there has been before. So in the past, so the sort of theological debates that would have once been confined to journals can now become, far more the subject of people's awareness. The kinds of failures of governance that many people would not have known about before can now be splayed across headlines very easily. And on the one hand, that creates a great kind of scandal, a great sort of kind of discouragement for Catholics and others about the state of the Catholic Church. On the other hand, that same openness allows the Church probably more easily than ever before, if she chooses to acknowledge those problems and to begin to address them. But before I talk about acknowledging those problems and beginning to address them, I want to talk about this fallacy which I just proffered, which is that that these things come at the worst possible time in the history of the world for the Church. And the reason I want to kind of correct myself there is because that's a trope that you hear very often, or that you might be inclined to hear very often, and a trope that we hear not only sort of about our ecclesial society, but about our political society as well. You don't have to sort of read very much, and I suspect you read a great deal, but you don't have to sort of read very much to recognize the sort of problem that human beings face of the narcissism of the immediate. And by that I mean we have a tendency, when we're assessing our ecclesial society, when we're assessing our political society, when we're assessing even our sort of families, to perceive that the problems that we're experiencing in the moment are the worst possible problems that have been experienced in history. Newman says we can become so centered on ourselves that we imagine with vanity that we're privileged enough to live in the worst time in history. But he says none of us really are. He says, in fact, perhaps a better way to think of it, at least for the Church, is that crisis is the ordinary vocation of the Church. That in every century the Church has experienced profound theological crises. And in every century the Church has experienced profound crises of governance. And in every century the Church's hierarchical leaders have given scandal to the people of God. And Newman says you can know that because Dante puts just about every bishop he writes about in hell, right? In fact, he paves the roads of hell with the skulls of bishop, right? Dante, we might think of Christendom as this sort of great flourishing of ecclesial life in which, the Middle Ages of Christendom as this sort of period of great flourishing in which bishops were bishops and they knew how to teach. But Dante has us walking across their skulls in order to get deeper and deeper into hell, right? So we can know that this is not the only period in history in which bishops are giving scandal. And we can think about the early councils of the Church, the early ecumenical councils of the Church, in which you guys have probably heard the story about St. Nicholas punching Arius. Have you guys heard that story? It's probably not true. I'm sorry to demythologize the Nicene Council, but it's probably not true. But there were bishops who, because they held to Orthodox doctrine about the Trinity, had to flee into the desert to hide from the combination of the Arian bishops and the emperors who were chasing after them, right? There have always been profound scandals and profound crises in the life of the Church. And the reason is because the things we believe and the way that we live together are so important to us that they're worth fighting over. That's what Newman says. He says, look, fundamentally, we fight over these things because we care about them so much, and because the creed that we profess is the most important thing that we profess in our lives. And so many of us have the sense that we better get it right. And the way that we worship is the most important thing that we do in our lives because man is made to worship. And so we better get it right. And the way that we pass on the faith is the most important thing that we do in terms of any kind of teaching or any kind of scholarship, any kind of intellectual activity we do. The most important intellectual activity we do is to try to understand divine revelation because we're made to be in communion with God. And so these things which so deeply touch who we are and what we're made for and how we live and how we might have salvation, of course, would be the occasion of controversy because people will hold deeply to the things which they believe about what they're made for and who God is. So it's the ordinary vocation of the Church to suffer in crisis. It's the ordinary vocation of the Church to suffer through scandal. Because the gospel is premised, the basic predication of the gospel is that all of us are sinners. The basic predication of the gospel is that we'll fail and need mercy. The whole of the gospel message, the whole of the life of the Church is predicated on the fact that we'll disappoint each other time and time again, and that we'll choose the wicked option as often as we choose the good option. And gradually, over time, with a great deal of effort, we might begin to choose the good more often and more often and more often. But it doesn't come easy to any one of us. So we should expect, Newman says, that the Church will let us down, that the leaders of the Church will let us down. because the basic premise of the thing is that we're sinners. And by the way, Newman, do you guys know very much about John Henry Newman? This is a tangent, but I like talking about Newman. John Henry Newman was a convert to the Catholic faith, a great academic at a university called Oxford, which is almost as good as Princeton. And he, like, one Oxford guy in the back row is like, "Sir, I've had enough," and he just gets up and walks out. He was a teacher at a university called Oxford, which is pretty good. And so Newman had a pretty good deal. He had tenure, and he had like a very light teaching load, which was basically like meet with students, drink tea, and talk about their chosen subject. It was a very nice situation for John Henry Newman. And then the bishops of Ireland came to him and said, "Hey, we need a Catholic university." And Newman was like, "I don't think that you do, because a lot of you guys over there in Ireland can't really read or anything, so I don't think that." And the bishops were like, "Well, we would like you to help us with that. We'd like you to start a Catholic university." And Newman was like, "Again, I work at Oxford. Like, we have a rowing team and everything. It's very good here." And you know, time after time they kept coming to him, and finally the bishops convinced him, "Come to Ireland, you can set up any kind of university you want. We just need a Catholic university because we have this sort of Anglican university, which is sort of Anglicizing, you know, our best and brightest. All of our smartest kids are becoming sort of Anglicanized, and we want to do something to temper that." So Newman says, "Okay, I'll come over, and I have some ideas about a university." And so he comes over, and I think maybe academics experience this sometime. He finds out that what was promised to him is not at all what the bishops had in mind. The bishops actually wanted him to start a seminary or a kind of pre-seminary, a program where he could find the smartest guys and convince them to become priests, and that was all they wanted. And Newman thought that they would read poetry and history and look at the stars and fight about philosophy, and the bishops thought that they would learn enough catechetical material to be able to hear confessions and celebrate Mass in Latin and then get out to parishes, because the bishops needed priests. And so they had a big fight, because Newman realized basically what they wanted is the name Newman above their seminary, and that was it. And he was profoundly let down, because every single time he came back to the bishops and said, "This is what we need to do," they said, "Yeah, that's very nice. How many vocations did you get for it?" And he's like, "That's not my thing," but they thought it was. So there was this back and forth, and he was profoundly disappointed. He felt that he'd been let down by the bishops time after time when he went back to Ireland, or when he went to Ireland, and he felt that they had just sold him a false bill of goods. Is that a phrase? Sold him a false bill of goods. And he left really discouraged. And it took him years to realize that in that period of discouragement in which he was being let down, time after time after time after time after time again, God had done something that he didn't have any idea was actually happening. Because Newman kept having to fight with the bishops about what a university was. He kept having to sort of tell them, because they thought a university was just like a seminary or maybe a high school, and they didn't get it, and they didn't understand what he wanted to do, which was to really have like a flourishing engagement, a formation of the whole person for good living in the truest sense of things. And so he had to write down to them in letter after letter after letter what the idea of a university was. And when he got back to England, he put those texts together, and he realized he'd sketched out a vision of a university that other people would find compelling. And the cool and providential part of that story is that today, Newman's idea of a university is the most foundational text for understanding. Even people who are not Catholic, but people who think that education exists for human flourishing, have taken Newman's idea of a university and said this, right? This is the model for what it means to be educated as a human person. This is the model for what it means to think about human flourishing in a university context. And it only came for Newman out of this profound disappointment in the bishops. And he said he thought there was something providential there, and he thought that may be the way that the church works. That in disappointing each other, in our failures to each other, in letting each other down, we often have to better articulate how we think God is moving in our lives. We often have to sort of give a defense for what we think God wants us to do. And sometimes, he said, in that defense, what God is calling us to becomes much clearer. So the reason I bring that up is because Newman sort of only realized in disappointment, and he only realized in a period of kind of crisis and scandal, that God was calling him to help this project of the reform and the renewal of the church. And he also identified that, as did Benedict XVI, as did John Paul II, as did Pope Francis, as did the Second Vatican Council, as a part of the vocation of lay Christians. The Second Vatican Council says that each of us have a responsibility to help the church fully and completely live her mission with integrity. I'm a canon lawyer, and so the Code of Canon Law says that a little bit differently. It says Christians have the right, and even at times the duty, to make their opinions known to their pastors about the life of the church and the needs of the church and the ministry of the church. We have the right, and even at times the duty, to make our opinions known about the life of the church. Now, the Code of Canon Law says Also, you have to do that respectfully, and you have to do that with recognition of the place of the sacred pastor and making judgments about the life of the church, which means you don't sort of just get into some sort of, well, I don't know that the Code of Canon Law was anticipating this, but which means you don't sort of just go on TikTok and make videos about how your bishop sucks or something like that. Like, that's not the idea here. But the idea here is to soberly and prayerfully and rooted in our Christian identity, articulate how the church can better live the Christian life, articulate how we as a communion can better give witness to the gospel. And so how do we do that? How do we effectively assist in the reform of the church, which is the correction of errors, or the correction of behavior without integrity, and the renewal of the church, which is the movement of the Holy Spirit to allow the church to better proclaim the gospel in the world? That is a big part of our vocation. And because it's a big part of our vocation, the way that we start that project, to which we're all called, is I think the way that we start the part of every element of our vocation, which is in the liturgy. We're right now, the church is in something called the Eucharistic Revival, TM, which is an initiative of the bishops to kind of get people to believe in the Eucharist more, and to sort of have more devotion to the Eucharist and more attention to the Eucharist. And I think that's really good, and I think that's really important. But one of the places where I think we should really start is something which I think many of us have heard about the Eucharist, but perhaps not given enough reflection to. That the Eucharist you've perhaps often heard, is to be the source and summit of the Christian life. The Eucharist is to be, the Second Vatican Council says, the font and apex of the Christian life. And when the Second Vatican Council says that the Eucharist is to be the source and summit of our life, she's not only talking about sort of devotion to the Eucharist and adoration, she's not only talking about receiving the Eucharist, but she's talking about the Mass. The Second Vatican Council actually says the Eucharistic sacrifice is to be the font and apex of the Christian life. So that means that if our vocation is to help affect the reform of the church, to help aid in the renewal of the church, to help the church be a better and more credible witness to life in Jesus Christ and to the saving promises of the gospel, then the place where all of us need to begin is in the Eucharist, is in the Mass. There are a few reasons for that. First of all, because we cannot hope to achieve anything in the Christian life apart from having a life of prayer. We cannot hope to achieve anything good for the gospel, on behalf of the gospel, or as Christians, if we do not begin with a life of prayer. Nothing we do on behalf of the gospel or as Christians will be real or authentic or credible if it doesn't begin with our own interior life. And the first place where we learn how to pray is the Mass. The Mass gives us a template for prayer. The Mass gives us an invitation to prayer. And the Mass gives us some important lessons about prayer. And one of those lessons, and one of the places why beginning with the Mass is so important, is because the Mass reminds us that the church is fundamentally a communion. Mass is never a private act. If Father Zach celebrates Mass by himself in his room every single day, I mean, it's a little bit disappointing for you guys because you're probably trying to go to Mass. Also, why would he do it? You have that really beautiful church over there that hardly anybody uses. But whenever Mass is celebrated, whether Mass is celebrated with hundreds of people or thousands of people, or one priest by himself, the Mass is always an act of the whole church. The Mass is always an act which is offered for and on behalf of all the baptized. When the priest offers the sacrifice at the altar, he offers that sacrifice in union with the sacrifices of our lives. We who carry a cross in the world, we who have to offer up little things in our life, we who have to suffer in the world, all of those things are offered with the sacrifice of the Eucharist, with the sacrifice of the body and blood of Jesus on the altar. And all of those things are sanctified through the altar. But there's a corporateness to that, there's a communal nature to that, which reminds us that the church is a community of the baptized. And that as a community of the baptized, each of us is called to live and regard each other with justice and integrity and charity. So the reform of the church, which is effectively a call for the church to live with justice, is fundamentally rooted to the justice of the altar, and to the integrity of the altar, and to the charity of the altar. But the liturgy also helps us to be formed as sons and daughters of the church, right? We receive from the church as her sons and daughters in the liturgy. Even the priest who offers the sacrifice is also reminded that he's a son of God the Father as he offers that sacrifice. And he's a son of our mother, the church, as he offers that sacrifice. And the reason why that's so important if we work for the reform and the renewal of the church is because we can only help the church to live with integrity as members of the communion who wish to maintain the communion of the church. No one ever affects reform in the church by standing on the outside yelling, right? Martin Luther aimed to effect reform of the church and at a certain point got fed up and sort of began to stand on the outside, literally nailing some complaints to the door. And those complaints mostly fell on hollow ears, right? Those complaints mostly fell on deaf ears, because standing sort of outside the communion of the church, saying, I separate myself from the communion of the church, I'm not concerned with this communion of the baptized, which becomes a communion with God, is not a way to live the Christian life. Rather, the fruit of the Christian life is to live in communion with Christ on the cross, and we do that through the altar. And the reform of the church, or the renewal of the church better proclaiming the gospel in the world, also only comes when it begins with people who are in communion with each other, who desire a holier and purer and more fruitful communion with each other. So the first thing is that the reform and the renewal of the church fundamentally begins with the liturgy of the church, with worship. That doesn't mean, when I say the reform and the renewal of the church fundamentally begins with the liturgy of the church and with worship, what I don't mean is if we all went to the traditional Latin Mass, or if all the Masses were celebrated ad orientem, or I went to Steubenville, so if every Mass did like this, the church would be better. I mean, it would be effectively more enjoyable for me if everything did like this because I went to Steubenville, but I don't mean that sort of liturgical unicity is the key to ecclesial reform. What I mean instead is that deep and serious liturgical worship, the full active participation our full active participation in the liturgy, which means bringing our sacrifices, bringing the things we offer up, bringing our crosses to the altar through the mystery of the sacrifice of Christ, is the thing which begins to transform us, and that transformation of us transforms the church. Sure, part of the transformation of the church is having a conversation about liturgy, and maybe they're like our whole hymnals that kind of suck and we should just toss them out. Sure, maybe there are lots of ways in which the liturgy of the church could be reformed, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the first place to begin is not to sort of stand athwart the liturgy and say, be prettier, be better, be more mysterious, be more ancient. The first place to start is to deeply immerse ourselves into the liturgy as it's offered, and to allow it to transform us, because the grace of the Eucharistic sacrifice is more profound, and I'm a person who thinks that the aesthetics of the liturgy matter a great deal, but the grace of the Eucharistic sacrifice is more profound even than the aesthetics of the sacred liturgy. And I think that's profoundly important for us to recognize, because there's a great temptation, I think, for us to sort of make an idolatry out of the aesthetics of the thing. And that separates us, I think, from what it can do and how it can transform us. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is that affecting the reform and the renewal of the church means that we tell the truth, and we not be afraid to tell the truth, and we become sons and daughters of the church who are disciples of the truth. And I say that in two ways. In terms of the crisis of governance in the life of the church, telling the truth means that all of us are willing to talk about our experiences, positive and negative, in the life of the church, and to hear other people's experiences, positive and negative, in the life of the church, without sort of creating immediately, as soon as people start talking about those experiences, a kind of friend-enemy distinction, or without sort of thinking that talking about our feelings is the kind of thing that doesn't get us anywhere, right? Because the only way that the church can affect the reform, which is asking Christ to heal the parts of the church which are wounded, is to bring those wounds to the fore, right? And to be unafraid of that, and to believe that the gospel is stronger than those wounds, and that the grace of God is able to transform them into something beautiful. So first, speaking the truth in that way. But the second way in which I mean speaking the truth is we who are Catholics, if we wish for the church to be a credible witness in the world, need to be Catholics who accept, embrace, study, and commit ourselves to the whole of Catholic doctrine, right? That we sort of not allow the kind of political segregation of Catholic doctrine, which is prevalent in our church, to define the way in which we believe it, right? To allow ourselves to sort of eschew that political segregation of doctrine and to see the whole of the thing. That the incarnation is important, and the parts of Catholic social teaching which conform to our preferred political opinions are important, and the parts of Catholic social teaching which don't conform to our preferred political opinions are important. That all of them express something profound about the mystery of God's relationship to the world, and that we have that we would be transformed by them, and they would become the lens by which we look at the world, instead of bringing the lenses of the world into the thing by which we examine and evaluate sacred doctrine. That we would allow ourselves to have the vision of a Catholic looking at the world, instead of having the vision of our particular political ideology or our particular sort of social position become the lens by which we evaluate Catholic doctrine. So telling the truth means that first and fundamentally, before I regard or before I kind of consider myself to be anything else, I recognize that my baptism is the thing which most transforms me, and that sacred doctrine, that the whole of the church's sacred doctrine, is the thing which gives me a lens into which to look at the world. So that's the other part of telling the truth. Now here's the third point I want to make, and then I'll shut up. The third point that I want to make. Also, did you guys read in the Daily Princetonian that today is the first day for the food trucks? Did you guys read the Daily Princetonian? Today is the first day for the food trucks, guys. That's super exciting. There's food trucks now. They're painted like a tiger. I bet that's something they do around here a lot. Anyway, I thought you'd be more excited about that. I thought you'd be more excited that I read the Daily Princetonian. Okay. The third point that I want to make is this, and it's not just because I want to flatter you, but I mean it. You guys are probably much more important than you think you are for the reform and the renewal of the church. And the reason for that is not just because sort of everyone's important and yippee-ki-yay and we all love each other, but you guys in particular are probably much more important for the reform and the renewal and the mission of the church in the world than you think you are. Because you love the church, because you can bring to the church the gifts that you have, the formation that you have, the energy that you have, the enthusiasm that you have, but also because you can approach some of the questions which have most vexed the church without the baggage that has sort of encumbered many of the people who aim to lead the church now. I mentioned that we are sort of relitigating many of the questions of the Second Vatican Council, many of the questions of the meaning of the Second Vatican Council and what it says about the mission of the church in the world. And much of that relitigation is taking place by people who come to the texts with presuppositions about what they say, and come to the text with presuppositions about what they should have said, or what they definitely don't say, or why we definitely aren't going to think they say what that guy says because we don't like that guy. They come with the sort of political prejudices and superficial tribal prejudices and ideological prejudices that have made the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council as much a sociological and political experiment as a textual analysis. But the fact of the matter is the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, which the church tells us, is the path by which we will engage the modern world, by which we will proclaim the gospel in the modern world. The texts of the Second Vatican Council have very rarely been approached as texts to find out what they actually say, and to be read without sort of 15 lenses of ideology and prejudice. And you guys probably are relatively free of those ideological lenses and prejudices because they're the debates of sort of old people. They're the debates of people who live. Now I realize not all of you are students. Father Zach, I'm very sorry. Father Zach, I'm so sorry that I said the debates of old people. No, oh, you're not students? I meant him. I only meant him. Honestly, Father Zach and I went to high school, but I have a better hairline than he does. So but we did go to high school together. But he's 1 grade older than I am, and I regard that as like a great separation. Like he's an old guy, and I'm the same young as you, which I'm actually not. But you have the opportunity to come to these things. You have the opportunity to come to these things without the sort of prejudices and biases that have plagued the implementation of the Second Vatican Council since its inception. Like from the very moment that the thing ended, there have been these ideological battles, and those have prevented a sort of careful reading of the text in what Benedict XVI called a hermeneutic of continuity with the Church's doctrine and tradition, and we need that very badly. And so I would just encourage you, if you want to offer a service to the church, get a book called Documents of Vatican II and read them, and just allow them to inform your vision of what it means to be a Catholic, apart from sort of what people of all ideologies might tell you they say, or apart from what people of all ideologies might tell you they don't say, or what they should have said, or whatever. Just sort of put all that aside and read them, because they offer to us, I think, a truly prophetic vision for engaging the world in a period of profound institutional disaffiliation and a profound sort of crisis of meaning for many people, like a profound existential crisis not only for people but for whole cultures. I think the Second Vatican Council offers for us a kind of particular platform of engagement for those kinds of relativistic crises that plague our whole society, a way of presenting Christ to the world in a way that will be meaningful and transformative. And you guys are, and I say this not just so I'll get invited back, but you guys are far more important in that project than you probably realize. So I hope you'll take that up. I hope you'll consider getting a book called Documents of the Second Vatican Council and reading them. But most especially, I hope that I can emphasize that the source of all elements of the Christian vocation begin with worship, that we are made to worship, and everything else good that we can do in our lives begins and ends with worship. And you have that opportunity here. And really you have the opportunity here, I think, beginning and ending with the Mass, but with so many other things, to be formed as a person who can be a witness to Christ in the world and find the meaning of your lives in that. And so I would encourage you for that, and I thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for that, JD. We now have time for a few questions. So if you could raise your hand if you have a question, I'll bring the mic to you. And then please pass the microphone to the next question. Thank you.
My question comes in 3 parts, and it's based upon an idea that I've been thinking about for a few... No, I'm not saying it, just people do.
Well, I did write it down.
Yeah. My question is actually just a speech about some of my own ideas. Not you, just that's something that people do sometimes at other colleges.
Okay.
Like Harvard. Oh my gosh, those guys are so...
Sorry, cool. Yeah, thank you.
He's like, are you done with that nonsense?
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to speak today.
Sure, thank you for having me.
Yeah. A really quick question, or maybe not quick, but something I thought that was really profound that you said. You were talking about like reform within the church as opposed to like apart from it, and how we fight for the church because we care. Mm-hmm. You as a journalist, I'm sure like you're constantly seeing, news from all different sources, good or bad, from different perspectives. How do you kind of persist in that and not get jaded or frustrated in your own profession?
Oh, dude, I'm super cynical. I probably shouldn't pretend that I probably should pretend that I'm not. But no, I mean, that there is a certain risk of that. I mean it when I say, like, whatever you do in the life of the church or in the life of the world as a Christian, the prospect for becoming jaded or becoming cynical is high. I suspect there are 3 priests here, and I suspect that none of them are cynics, but I suspect they know some priests who are probably cynical. Even in sort of priestly life and ministry, which is filled with these incredible moments of grace and engagements with the forgiveness of people's sins, there's a temptation to cynicism. I think the devil wants us to sort of trade in our hope for trade in Christian hope for something which we might regard as sort of urbane sophistication or realism or something like that, right? Like we're like, no, I'm just pragmatic about these things, when really what I think often happens is the devil sort of chips away at our hope and our belief in the power of grace. So how do we maintain a belief in the power of grace? The sacramental life, like the power of confession is not only that our sins are forgiven and our relationship is restored with God, but that if you go to confession with regularity and you take seriously the Christian life and you try to develop a prayer life and you begin to see things growing in you as a result of that, like you begin, even if your prayer life starts with, Lord, I don't know how to pray and I hardly know what that means, and then you sit there for 5 minutes, over time that changes, and that changes you. And even if you go to confession and you sort of say, I don't know very much about what I'm doing here, or even how to sort out what's good and what's bad, what choices I should be making and what choices I shouldn't be making, over time I think you can see the fruits of grace in your life, in the sacramental life, in the spiritual life, and that, I think, is an antidote to the temptation to cynicism. Like, I mean it, like you can't, there's nothing you can do that won't jade you and make you cynical and despondent even. You can do just about anything and become jaded and cynical and despondent if it's not rooted in prayer and the sacramental life, because people will inevitably let you down. But I think if you see how God is working in your own life and the life of the people who you know and love, and if you see the way in which grace can be transformative and healing, that over time is an enduring source of hope. Yeah.
Next question.
Hi, John Garaffa, Princeton 2020 alum. Also, I work here.
At Princeton?
Yeah,
Are you a professor at Princeton University?
I'm not a professor.
Oh, wow, that would.
Great to meet you. I was just wondering if you could speak more on the role of media, social media. Basically, I'm also a convert to the faith, and I feel like in large part I read my way into the church by reading a lot of articles, and especially Catholic Answers. And I had a lot of help too, but in some sense, you created a good tension by mentioning how, in one sense, lay people can engage in debate in a lot more of a quick and I'd say a very like lightning fast way, which I don't believe would have been possible in, say, when these debates were started in the early 50s and 60s. But you also mentioned very briefly a positive, how openness through the internet and through other digital information technology allows the church to promulgate its policies and make them more wider known. So I was just wondering if you could speak more on that, and how can lay people engage with social media in a fruitful way?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are probably a lot of people who say just, there are, I mean, it's not that there probably are. There are a lot of people who just say, social media is sort of bad for human flourishing, period. We shouldn't use it. I'm not, I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm ultimately not convinced by it, because I do think there's a profound potential for human community in that has been created by the internet, that has the potential, that has which we have to approach very cautiously because of the serious potential for it to exacerbate kind of loneliness and isolation, and especially kind of envy, and to inflame our passions. But at the same time, if we approach it cautiously, and if we sort of are aware of those dangers, there's also the possibility for people who are living in the most atomized and isolated period in recent history to better find a community of like-minded people. And it would be nice if we sort of all kind of knew our neighbors and had them over for a potluck. But as George Weigel once said to me, it'd also be nice if I had a pony. Ha 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 ha. So I mean, what happened? Oh, there's a computer here that I've been leaning on. Wow. So with that said, man, imagine if I was super smooth and now I had a PowerPoint about that exact question. But I do think there's a great potential there, and I do think there's a potential there for to form authentic human relationships. Benedict XVI, who only was Pope during the nascent days of social media, but saw what was unfolding, said, "Look, what he was thinking of, sort of pre-social media, you might think, but sort of said the potential of communication on the internet is good in as much as it facilitates real." By which he meant offline human engagement. But the potential of social media is good in as much as it draws us into deeper, actual, authentic human communities with each other, instead of just the superficiality of here's what I ate for dinner, or I'm a Princeton suckers, or whatever, And I think that's true. I think for the church and for any society, I think it's good that the church, I think it's good. It is not the culture of the church, the institutional, the culture of the church, to think of itself as an open society, for lots of reasons, some of which are good historically, some of which are not good historically. But I think in this period of history, when we're learning so much across so many spheres of society about the danger of sort of closed administrative societies, it is good for the church to become much more of an authentically open society. It is good for us to understand the way in which decision making happens in general and in particular situations. It is good for us to understand the information which is available to leaders as they make decisions, especially because the church is not a democratic society. And good, the church should not be a democratic society, save for monasteries. But the church is not a democratic society, and therefore it has an additional challenge, like crisis of credibility, in a world which presupposes that democracy is the most credible form of government. And so openness about information, I think, often can overcome, like openness about information and decision making, I think often can overcome the fact that the church is kind of at a disadvantage from the moment she opens her mouth because she's constitutionally an autocratic society, you know. So I think that's good, and I think the internet helps us to do that.
Does this work? Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mr. Flynn, for your talk. I've been a reader of The Pillar in a good way for the last year or so. So I was really excited to come to your talk today.
Well, thank you for reading The Pillar.
Having being a Pillar reader, I know you have correspondents in other countries.
I do.
I was wondering, how do the issues you touched on today about the life of the church play out differently, or maybe they don't play out differently, in countries like Nigeria or Nicaragua, where the problems at the front of people's minds are like persecution and maybe not like being pro-life or pro-family?
So we benefit, I think, from the perspective of seeing the universal church and seeing the persecution of Christians in places like Nigeria and Nicaragua and so many others. In India, for God's sake, Christians in India are really facing atrocious kinds of violence. And I think we benefit from that because it's helpful for us to be reminded of our obligation to solidarity with the suffering church and our sort of honest to God baptismal communion with the suffering church, and I think in a probably human way that I don't want to sound too much of a cliche, helps us to like put our problems in perspective, so to speak. Although I don't think we should instrumentalize suffering Christians to make ourselves feel better about our problems. But those places, one of the things that we've really wanted to do with The Pillar, and I think we could do a better job of it, is that we can be very one-dimensional about the way we see the church in suffering places, that we can sort of think of the church in places where Christians face atrocious violence as sort of the only story of the church in those places is atrocious violence. And when we do that, I think we sort of make a caricature of the Christians there, and probably also that stereotype enables other problems in the church's life to creep in. And I'll give you an example of that. Do you remember when some of you might remember last year when the Catholic University of America released a study about the degree to which priests trust their bishops, and the result was that they don't? Well, I was talking with our Nigeria correspondent about that, who's a priest in Nigeria. And I asked him, I said, like, what I wanted him to do was get reactions from Nigerian priests to what these American priests had said about their bishops, and just like, what do you think the dynamics of trust is here? And he said, well, we would never have a study like that in Nigeria. And I said, because I said, why? And he said, like, no one would ever answer a study like that. And he said, no one would ever say something critical about the bishop like that. And I said, oh, because you guys all trust your bishop? And he said, no, because we're all afraid of the bishop. Like, we have a very older institutional sort of model of the sort of Lord Bishop. In fact, they refer to the bishop in Nigeria as my Lord Bishop, right? And so we wouldn't even think that it was appropriate for us to manifest these things. Now, maybe there's something good about that, and that sometimes I think that there can be, sometimes I think, with respect, fathers, sometimes I think American priests can put too much on their bishops. They expect him, there are a great number of American priests who didn't have a father or have a good relationship with their father and expect the bishop to have too many kinds of paternal roles for them, and I think that can create problems too. But on the whole, I think it's good for us to understand the dynamics of this trust thing and for bishops to figure it out and priests to figure it out. And the fact that, you know, my Nigerian correspondent says, well, we wouldn't even be able to say that out loud, we can't even conceive that, tells me, okay, they actually probably are in need of kinds of reform with regard to this too, because that dynamic isn't healthy. And the way we know that dynamic isn't healthy is because we had that dynamic in a period called the 1890s and the 1950s, and we saw that it led to priests leading double lives and keeping money off the books and finding themselves in other compromised moral situations. So we can say this leads to dysfunction. And so I think it is good, as much as we can learn from the suffering and persecuted church, I think that there are elements of American ecclesiastical life that people in other parts of the world will eventually need to borrow from. Like we covered in Nigeria a couple years ago the investigation of an allegation of abuse of an adult but a vulnerable person by a priest. And it was the first investigation of abuse of a vulnerable person by a priest in Nigeria's history. And the way that I know that is because a bishop in Nigeria said to me, "Do you think I'm going to be investigating all these things now?" Like, it was just like, it was a perfect 2002 answer that you would have gotten in the United States. And what it's told me is they have not had any of the kind of recognition of the potential for problems that we have had. And so we can sort of take the benefit of our experience and say, look, these places which are suffering in many ways also need to attend to the internal life of the church and the good governance of the church and those kinds of things. Is that what you're asking? Or were you asking something different?
Yeah, I think like I know also maybe like another angle would be like in the U.S. and in the U.K. there's a lot of concern for like liturgical preferences, and those discussions are maybe not being had even like in other places in Europe, right? But I mean I think your answer was answered my question too.
Okay,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's also true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like it's funny because Bishop Alvarez, the bishop in Nicaragua, who's in prison now, he's been sentenced to prison for 26 years for daring to speak out against the government, which is this oppressive, despotic regime. I was watching a video of him celebrating Mass while he was under house arrest, and he was live streaming these videos on Facebook Live where he was celebrating Mass, and like it's just terrifically heroic because he's being in danger of being persecuted and stuff. And I was showing this to my seminarians, and one guy says, he doesn't even have an amice on. And I was just, which is true, he didn't have an amice on, which is a special liturgical vestment that a priest is supposed to wear, and in the United States we take it as a connotation of being liberal if he's not wearing it. But it was such a strange response, you know what I mean? It was sort of surreal. And so it can be helpful for us to see that the world doesn't begin and end with our liturgical debates, although I think the guy should have worn an amice. Yeah.
That brings us to the end of our official time, so please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you for having me.